What if I told you that the deadliest war in human history wasn't World War II? Not even close. It wasn't fought in Europe. It didn't involve tanks or planes. And yet, it killed more people than any conflict humanity has ever seen. If you're interested in history without comfort or myths, subscribe to Fragments of History, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. When people picture history's deadliest conflicts, they reach for familiar names. World War II, often estimated at 70 to 85 million dead. World War I, the Mongol conquests, the Napoleonic Wars. These are the wars that fill textbooks, shape national identities, and return again and again in films, memorials, and classrooms. But the bloodiest war in human history may not be any of them. It wasn't fought in Europe. It didn't involve tanks, aircraft, or trenches cut by machine guns. It unfolded inside one country over 14 years and tore through the lives of ordinary people with a slow, grinding cruelty. By many estimates, the dead numbered in the tens of millions, often cited around 20 to 30 million, and sometimes higher. The figures vary because the scale was so vast and the record so broken that certainty itself became a casualty. The conflict was the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864, one of history's great catastrophes and one of its great silences. Ask educated Western audiences about the 19th century and you'll hear a familiar map of memory: the American Civil War, the unification of Germany, the spread of European empires. The Taiping Rebellion, despite a death toll that dwarfs most of these events, survives as a footnote, if it appears at all. Not because it was small, but because it happened in the wrong place, to the wrong people, and left behind the wrong kind of story. Part of the erasure is structural. The war exploded inside China at a moment when European powers treated Asia as peripheral to real history. History that, in their view, happened in Europe, and increasingly in North America. Western scholarship and public memory tended to follow Western interests. A civil war deep in China's interior could be observed, even feared, but it was not absorbed into the narrative that the West told itself about the 19th century. Then, there is the problem of storytelling. Western wars are remembered through thick layers of cultural machinery: memoirs, novels, monuments, anniversaries, museums, school curricula. World War I produced massive archives of letters, photographs, and testimony that still shape public imagination. The Taiping Rebellion left far fewer sources that were accessible to Western audiences, fewer translated accounts, fewer works that made the conflict legible to outsiders. Without a narrative frame, even the worst catastrophe can fade into abstraction. Duration, too, worked against memory. 6 years of World War II already feel almost impossible to hold in the mind. 14 years is something else entirely. It is long enough for children to grow up inside it, long enough for whole regions to experience war, not as an episode, but as a climate. A conflict that persists that long begins to lose the clean edges historians love. A clear beginning, a turning point, a neat conclusion. It becomes an age, an atmosphere, a slow collapse that doesn't end so much as exhaust itself. China's population scale made the disaster both more devastating and harder to comprehend. In the mid-19th century, China held hundreds of millions of people. When tens of millions die within that population, the proportion is staggering. Yet the raw number is so large, it resists emotional comprehension. The mind reaches a limit. Past it, deaths stop sounding like lives and start sounding like math. And this war did not present death in the way modern memory prefers to record it. It wasn't only the spectacle of battle, rows of bodies on a single field, uniforms counted, casualties listed in clean columns. Much of the killing happened away from combat, in the places where history keeps fewer receipts: the village road, the emptied granary, the sick room, the refugee trail. When agricultural systems broke, starvation followed. When sanitation failed and populations were pushed into flight, disease spread. When armies moved through the countryside, the line between soldier and civilian blurred until it disappeared. People died in places that never made it into official reports for reasons that were never written down, in numbers later guessed by comparing what census records existed before and after the violence. That is one of the cruelest truths of the Taiping Rebellion. The dead were often invisible even as they died. Civilian suffering dominated the casualty toll in a way that conventional war narratives struggle to absorb. Military history is comfortable with battles, commanders, tactics. The Taiping Rebellion was, in its heaviest weight, a humanitarian catastrophe. Farmers whose fields were destroyed, townspeople trapped by siege, refugees collapsing on forced migrations, children and the elderly swallowed by famine and epidemic. The scale of suffering makes heroism feel irrelevant. The defining feature is not victory. It is endurance and then disappearance. Outside powers did not document the war in the way they documented their own. European states held commercial interests along China's coast, but much of the catastrophe unfolded far from those enclaves. Western witnesses existed, missionaries, merchants, advisors, but their accounts were partial, sometimes distorted, and never enough to capture the full geography of collapse. Modern scholarship has done more to recover the Taiping Rebellion, but global cultural memory still treats it as marginal. Many people can name Verdun and the Somme without hesitation. Few can name a conflict that may have killed as many or more people than World War I and perhaps approach the scale of World War II. Without modern weaponry, without global alliances, without the machinery of 20th century industrial slaughter. Put the numbers beside each other and the mind recoils. The American Civil War, often called America's Bloodiest, killed roughly 620,000. The Taiping Rebellion killed tens of millions. Dozens of civil wars stacked into one prolonged implosion. And yet it rarely enters the common historical imagination. That silence forces an uncomfortable question. Whose deaths become history and whose become background? If casualty count alone determined importance, the Taiping Rebellion would dominate our memory of human violence. The fact that it doesn't tells us what really decides remembrance, cultural proximity, the availability of narrative, the priorities of empires, the stories that powerful societies choose to preserve. But understanding why this war is forgotten doesn't explain how it became possible. What kind of country can absorb 14 years of civil war? What pressures make a society so brittle that a single rupture becomes a wound that won't close? Before the first armies marched and the first cities starved, China was already under strain, packed, unequal and simmering. And that is where the real story begins. By the early 19th century, the Qing dynasty ruled over one of the largest empires on earth, stretching from the Pacific coast into Central Asia, from the Siberian frontier down towards Southeast Asia. It governed roughly 400 million people, more than a third of humanity. To outsiders, the Qing state looked ancient, stable, inevitable. But stability was a surface illusion. Underneath it, China was tightening into a crisis, slow at first, then accelerating, until collapse stopped being a possibility and became a direction. The pressure began with the simplest force of all, numbers. China's population had surged over the previous century, rising from roughly 150 million around 1700 to more than 400 million by 1850. This wasn't steady growth. It was expansion so rapid that the empire's foundations couldn't adjust. New world crops, corn, sweet potatoes, helped people survive on poorer soil and in harsher terrain. But that solution had a cruel logic. It didn't solve scarcity. It postponed it. It allowed more people to be born into a system that could not sustain them. Agricultural land could not expand at the same pace. The richest regions were already cultivated to exhaustion. What remained were marginal lands, hillsides that eroded, valleys that flooded, fields with unreliable rainfall. Families cleared them anyway because hunger makes every slope look like a farm. The result was degradation, exhausted soil, increased erosion, worsening floods, shrinking productivity. The population climbed while the resource base frayed. This was a Malthusian trap at national scale. Millions lived on plots too small to reliably feed a family. One poor harvest meant hunger. Two meant death for those already weak, children, the elderly, the sick. Most of the empire lived permanently on the edge of famine, with no cushion, no reserves, and no room for error. Survival was seasonal. Misfortune was fatal. Economic fragility deepened the damage. China's economy remained overwhelmingly agricultural. More than 90% of the population farmed for a living. When food production stagnated, while mouths multiplied, per capita income fell. People worked as hard as ever and became poorer anyway, because the surplus, the margin between life and collapse, kept thinning. The old safety nets began to fail. Extended families that once absorbed hardship were now too large and too poor to carry additional burdens. Community grain stores that could once blunt a bad year were inadequate for villages that had doubled and tripled in size. The mutual aid that made peasant life barely sustainable was crushed under the weight of sheer numbers. As conditions tightened, social tensions multiplied faster than the state could contain them. The Confucian order depended on stable hierarchies and reciprocal obligations, an elite that governed, a peasantry that endured, and a system that promised moral legitimacy in exchange for obedience. But rapid population growth eroded that balance. There were not enough roles in the traditional economy for the number of young men coming of age. Education could not expand fast enough. The result was a swelling mass of literate, frustrated youth with no path forward. Men trained to hope, then forced to watch hope become mockery. Land distribution grew more unequal as competition intensified. Wealthy families consolidated property. Poor families split plots among sons until each share became too small to support a household. Landlessness rose. Millions with no property, no stable work, no fixed place inside the social structure. These people were mobile, desperate and unanchored. They didn't need to be convinced that order was failing. They lived that truth daily. And where scarcity breeds anger, corruption supplies its target. The Qing administrative machine governed vast territories through relatively few officials. Many were underpaid, and the system quietly assumed they would extract fees from the population to survive. That arrangement incentivized predation. Officials squeezed communities for what they could take, knowing they might be transferred before consequences returned to them. The state became something felt not as protection, but as extraction. Tax collection embodied this rot. Official rates might be modest, but actual collections often far exceeded them. Layers of intermediaries took their share. Wealthy families used influence to evade the burden, pushing it downward onto those least able to pay. The gap between imperial policy and lived reality became a wound, not just economic hardship, but rage, because it taught people that the state's morality was a performance. Military weakness completed the pattern. The Qing armies that had once conquered China had decayed. The banner system, hereditary elite units, had hardened into something ceremonial, an institution of stipends rather than combat readiness. Provincial forces were underfunded, poorly trained, and often reluctant to fight. The empire still looked immense on a map, but its ability to enforce order was hollowing out. Inequality had reached levels that mocked the Confucian ideal of harmonious hierarchy. The richest merchants and landowners lived in luxury that rivaled European aristocracy. The poorest peasants lived barely above subsistence, their lives defined by debt, hunger, and vulnerability. The middle, the smallholders who had long formed the backbone of Chinese society, was being squeezed into tenancy and poverty, disappearing in slow motion. This inequality was not abstract, it was existential. The wealthy survived bad harvests by buying grain from distant regions or drawing on reserves. The poor starved. The wealthy bribed officials to escape obligations. The poor carried taxation and conscription in full. The wealthy had choices when conditions worsened. The poor had only desperation. Rebellion in that environment didn't feel like madness, it began to feel like physics. China had seen uprisings before. The White Lotus Rebellion, 1796–1804, had taken years to suppress and drained state strength. The Eight Trigrams Uprising, 1813, had briefly threatened Beijing itself. Smaller revolts flared constantly. Bandit groups, secret societies, ethnic conflicts, tax riots. Each suppression cost money, manpower, legitimacy. Each one proved the same point. Armed resistance was possible, and the state's grip could slip. The pattern was visible to anyone willing to look. Population growth outpacing resources, economic pressure creating masses of desperate people, corruption destroying legitimacy, military weakness making rebellion feasible. China was not a stable empire facing temporary troubles. It was a civilization in structural crisis, leaning toward catastrophe. Foreign pressure worsened the internal strain. The First Opium War, 1839–1842, exposed Qing vulnerability and forced humiliating concessions. This was not only a coastal trauma, it shook the ideological foundation of rule itself. The emperor was meant to hold the mandate of heaven, moral authority so complete that even outsiders recognized it. Defeat by barbarians suggested something far more dangerous than military weakness, that heaven's sanction was failing. The silver-based economy destabilized under the opium trade imbalance. Silver flowed out to pay for imports, driving deflation that made debt heavier and taxes harsher. Peasants who had borrowed in different conditions now faced repayment in an economy that punished them for surviving. Land loss accelerated. Indebtedness spread. Desperation became normal. Then nature struck. Floods, droughts, failures of harvest. The Yellow River flooded catastrophically multiple times in the 1840s, displacing millions and destroying farmland. Other regions suffered drought and hunger. None of this was unprecedented in Chinese history, but disaster hit a population with no reserves, no resilience, and increasingly no belief that the government could or would save them. By 1850, China was a powder keg, hundreds of millions under strain, a state unable to solve structural problems, corruption rotting legitimacy, and repeated uprisings proving that order could be challenged. All that was missing was a spark, and that spark was already moving through the countryside, carried by a failed scholar and the certainty of a divine mission. Hong Yuquan was a failed scholar. He sat for the imperial examinations again and again, trying to enter the bureaucratic elite by the only path Confucian China truly respected. Each time he failed. That alone wasn't unusual. These exams were engineered to break most people, with pass rates sometimes falling below 1%. But for Hong, failure didn't end in disappointment. It became a fracture, a private collapse that would eventually spill outward and drown entire provinces. In 1837, after another defeat, Hong suffered what looked like a total breakdown. For days he lived inside visions, intense, consuming, beyond anything his world could explain. He later described meeting an elderly man with a golden beard who warned him that demons were corrupting the world. A second figure, a middle-aged man, taught him how to kill them. When Hong regained his health, he did not return to who he had been. Whatever had happened in those days stayed inside him like a second pulse. Years later, he encountered Christian missionary tracts. Reading them, he reached backward into his own visions and reassembled them into a new meaning. The elderly man was God. The middle-aged man was Jesus Christ, Hong's older brother. And Hong himself was not simply a man who had failed the exams. He was the younger son of God, sent to earth with a mission: establish the heavenly kingdom, purge China of demons, and tear down what he now identified as corruption made flesh, the Manchu Qing rulers and the religious world that supported them. It was a synthesis that no church recognized. By Christian standards, it was heresy. But heresy is not measured by doctrine alone. It is measured by what it can ignite. Hong's theology blended fragments of Christianity, older Chinese religious concepts, and the authority of personal revelation. What it offered was millenarian certainty. The world was broken, the enemy was real, and salvation required violence. For people living under hunger, corruption, and humiliation, that certainty could feel like oxygen. Hong drew followers, not just believers, organizers, enforcers, voices that expanded the movement beyond one man's visions. Yang Xiuqing, a charcoal seller who claimed he could speak with God's voice, brought the discipline and command Hong lacked. Xiao Chaogui spoke as Jesus Christ, reinforcing the divine family Hong had declared. Feng Yunshan built the framework, converts organized into a movement with rules, structure, and the beginnings of an army. Together, they forged a leadership that fused religious authority with practical control. And the promises they made were not modest reforms. They were total replacement, spiritual salvation through Hong's version of Christianity: confess, submit, accept his role in the divine order, and be saved. Economic transformation through redistribution and equality. Social revolution, gender equality, including women serving in armies and administration. Ethnic equality, advancement by merit rather than inherited privilege. Political upheaval, the Qing would be destroyed and replaced by the heavenly kingdom of great peace. For populations already living on the edge, these promises landed with terrible force. Recruitment surged in Guangxi, one of China's poorest provinces, already strained by ethnic tensions, especially between the Hakka minority and local groups. Converts weren't only joining a religion, they were stepping into an alternative society, one that claimed it could rewrite the rules of survival. At first, the break with the state was not a single moment. Taiping communities practiced quietly, but their rejection of traditional religious life and refusal to participate in established social structures made them visible. Local authorities treated them as a dangerous cult. Efforts to suppress them did what suppression often does. It drove the movement underground, tightened its cohesion, and sharpened its sense of persecution into certainty. By 1850, the Taiping were no longer a scattered fringe. They were a quasi-military organization, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, organized, committed, and preparing for conflict. When Qing officials moved decisively to crush them in early 1851, they found something they did not understand. Not a small sect, but a mobilized force with religious fervor that made conventional intimidation meaningless. The first violence was a warning of what kind of war this would become. Taiping forces didn't only fight government troops. They destroyed temples, smashed icons, and executed those they labeled demon worshippers, often anyone who practiced traditional religion. This was not a rebellion seeking a better tax rate or a new governor. It was an apocalyptic project aimed at remaking civilization. Mobilization followed with frightening speed. Early victories brought new recruits in waves. Farmers abandoned their fields. Entire villages converted together. A movement measured in thousands at the edge of 1850 swelled to tens of thousands in 1851, then to hundreds of thousands by 1852. That growth was strength and instability. Most followers were new converts. Little training, little ideological depth, loyalty rooted less in doctrine than in desperation. The Taiping could field enormous armies, but size did not guarantee control. The movement became simultaneously unstoppable and fragile, powerful enough to overwhelm, unstable enough to fracture. The Qing response was slow and ineffective, which only fed the fire. Provincial forces were defeated repeatedly. Banner troops from the capital performed badly. Each failure sent the same message outward. The dynasty could be beaten, and belief became fuel. People joined because they thought the Taiping would win. Then the Taiping won because more people joined. The point of no return arrived quickly. Within months, both sides understood there could be no settlement. The Taiping demanded the complete overthrow of the Qing and the transformation of Chinese society. The Qing could not tolerate a movement that rejected the emperor's legitimacy and threatened the entire order of life. Compromise wasn't merely unlikely, it was impossible by definition. In 1853, Taiping forces captured Nanjing, one of China's greatest cities, and declared it their capital. They renamed it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. Now they held real territory, commanded armies in the hundreds of thousands, and posed an existential threat to the dynasty. But that victory carried a darker consequence. Once the Taiping became a state, they had to defend borders, govern populations, secure supply lines, and maintain discipline in a war that was no longer a surge. It was a grind. And the Qing, now fully awake, began to mobilize for total war. Neither side understood what was forming in front of them. The Taiping believed divine mission would guarantee triumph. The Qing believed resources and tradition would crush rebellion. Both expected the end to come quickly. Instead, the conflict metastasized into 14 years of slaughter, collapse, and famine. A rebellion born from visions of heavenly transformation would turn vast stretches of China into something closer to a wasteland, and the worst was still ahead. The armies of the Taiping Rebellion bore little resemblance to the professional forces fighting in Europe at the same time. There were no clean formations of uniformed soldiers moving between clear fronts. What marched across China were improvised masses, hundreds of thousands and eventually millions. Armed bodies gathered into units that called themselves armies, but often behaved like armed migrations. Taiping ranks were filled mainly with peasants who had abandoned farming for war. Most had no training beyond what combat taught them, and they carried whatever they could acquire: spears, swords, farm tools hammered into weapons, and over time, firearms captured from government troops or obtained through foreign merchants. The image of a Taiping soldier was not a professional in uniform. It was a former farmer gripping a spear, convinced his violence had been assigned a sacred purpose. There was organization, but it was never stable. The Taiping tried to impose religious structure on military reality. Separate armies by gender, rank tied partly to spiritual status, discipline enforced through indoctrination. But war does not submit to doctrine. Necessity constantly reshaped the movement. Units that held together were preserved. Those that collapsed were broken apart, reformed, absorbed, replaced. Discipline varied by leadership, circumstance, and how a given unit had been formed. Early converts, core believers, often held tighter cohesion, anchored by genuine commitment. Later recruits were different. Many joined because the Taiping controlled their region, because they were coerced, or because survival demanded it. Those units could become barely controlled mobs. Under the same banner, you could find fanatically disciplined fighters marching beside groups that looked less like soldiers and more like armed bandits. The Qing side was no model of order either. The banner and green standard forces had decayed so severely that they struggled against determined opponents. The dynasty increasingly leaned on regional armies raised by local leaders, forces nominally loyal to the throne, but defined by personal command and local power. Some were trained into something approaching professionalism under commanders like Zhang Guofan. Others were little more than paid muscle, dangerous to enemies and civilians alike. Both sides practiced brutality that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to war. The Taiping believed they were fighting demons and building heaven on earth. That conviction stripped restraint away. Captured government soldiers were often executed. Conquered populations faced forced conversion, accept Taiping Christianity or face confiscation, persecution, or death. Temples were destroyed, icons smashed, religious texts burned. Traditional practitioners were targeted not as opponents, but as contamination. Government forces responded with equal savagery. Taiping prisoners were tortured and executed publicly to warn others. Communities suspected of supporting the rebellion were punished as a whole. Villages burned, populations massacred, survivors scattered. The conflict hardened into reciprocal atrocity. Mercy became a liability. Restraint was treated as failure. Violence escalated because both sides believed they could not afford to stop. As the years dragged on and casualties mounted, recruitment shifted from persuasion to coercion. Early on, many joined willingly, driven by belief, desperation, or the hope of plunder. Later, both sides resorted to forced conscription. Taiping forces swept through villages taking able-bodied men. Government armies pressed peasants into service under threat of punishment. For countless soldiers, fighting was not a choice between causes. It was a choice between obedience and death. The cost of recruitment itself was immense. Men taken during critical farming seasons meant crops went unplanted and unharvested, feeding the famines that followed. Families lost their primary labor. Communities were stripped of young men, leaving children, women, and the elderly to scrape the earth for survival. Even when a conscript lived, his absence could kill those who depended on him. Campaigns became death marches, not only for soldiers, but for everyone pulled into their wake. Armies moved with families, camp followers, refugees seeking protection, merchants chasing profit. These were not small trains. They were moving populations, tens of thousands, sometimes more, crossing landscapes that could not sustain them. They consumed what they found, stripped villages, and left hunger behind. Those who couldn't keep pace, the sick, the injured, the exhausted, were discarded. Many died where they fell, unnamed, uncounted. Logistics barely existed in any professional sense. Armies lived by foraging, requisition, and plunder. It might be framed as taxation or necessity, but for civilians it meant the same thing. Whatever food remained was taken by people with weapons. A region might be stripped once by one force, and then stripped again when the next arrived, until there was nothing left but empty storage pits and exhausted soil. Sieges distilled the war's cruelty into something almost methodical. Cities became traps. Populations inside were slowly starved as supplies dwindled and hope collapsed. In multiple besieged cities, cannibalism occurred, not as a single horror story, but as what starvation forced when every other source of food disappeared. Contemporary accounts describe markets selling human flesh, families consuming the dead, moral life collapsing under the pressure of absolute hunger. These were not quick operations with decisive outcomes. Cities could be surrounded for years. Armies waited outside, while people inside died in stages. First the poor, then the children, then the rest. Starvation became a weapon applied with patience rather than rage, a slow, deliberate pressure until a city broke or relief arrived. And throughout the rebellion, there were no stable front lines. Territories shifted constantly. Regions changed hands again and again, each occupation bringing extraction, violence, and punishment. A village might swear loyalty to one side, only to be seized by the other weeks later, making yesterday's survival choice into today's death sentence. Civilians could not stay out of the war because the war had no edge. It moved through every road, every field, every market. This absence of clear lines turned the entire conflict into a civilian catastrophe. People were treated as resources to be consumed and threats to be eliminated. The countryside became both battlefield and larder. Survival depended less on allegiance than on luck, and luck ran out quickly. Casualties rose, not primarily through battle, but through everything that followed battle. Combat killed thousands, collapse killed millions. A region might lose a fraction of its population to fighting, and then far more to famine and disease. When fields could not be worked, reserves were seized, and the thin architecture of rural life gave way. Even the numbers inside the war became difficult for participants to comprehend. Commanders led forces of 50 to 100,000. Multiple armies moved across vast territories at once. At the rebellion's peak, the total number of people under arms, both sides, including followers and support, may have reached several million, a human mass comparable to whole European nations. But as vast and brutal as these armies were, they still caused only part of the death. The real killing happened away from the battlefield, after the marching, after the plunder, after the harvest failed. In villages that armies passed through like storms, in fields that no one could farm, in regions where the collapse of order made survival itself feel like a temporary mistake. The true horror of the Taiping Rebellion wasn't the battles, it was what happened to the people who lived between the armies, under them, behind them, people who never carried a weapon and never chose a side. Most of the estimated 30 to 70 million dead were not soldiers killed in combat. They were civilians killed by the systematic destruction of everything that made life possible. Famine was the primary executioner, operating on a scale that dwarfed even the direct violence. The agricultural cycle that fed China's immense population required three things: stability, labor, and time. The war destroyed all three. Fields went unplanted when farmers were conscripted or fled advancing forces. Crops were burned by retreating armies using scorched earth tactics. Harvests were seized by whichever side controlled the region at collection time, leaving nothing stored for winter. What was taken wasn't only grain, it was the margin that kept families alive between seasons. And once that margin vanished, the killing multiplied. A region that lost one harvest faced hunger, lose 2 seasons in a row, and starvation began. 3 failed cycles meant mass death, not only from the ache of hunger itself, but from what follows: disease tearing through weakened bodies, cold finishing those too frail to keep warm, communities collapsing when survival can no longer be achieved through ordinary means. Entire provinces fell into multi-year famine. The Yangtze River Valley, normally among China's most productive agricultural regions, was devastated. Places that had sustained tens of millions were reduced to a fraction of that number. The pattern of death was grimly predictable. First the very young and the very old, then the sick, then the weak. Eventually, even healthy adults succumbed as months of inadequate nutrition dismantled the body from the inside. Contemporary observers left accounts that still unsettle. Missionaries, merchants, and officials described landscapes emptied of life, villages where everyone had died or fled, fields swallowed by weeds because no one remained to farm them, roads lined with corpses of people who collapsed trying to reach food. The scale made personal tragedy difficult to see. You weren't witnessing isolated suffering. You were watching the extinction of communities. Then came disease. Epidemics moved through populations whose immune systems had been hollowed out by hunger and whose sanitation had collapsed. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, and other diseases killed in waves, not because the war created them, but because the war created perfect conditions. Contaminated water, overcrowded refugee movement, bodies already weakened, and the absence of any public health response. Famine and epidemic fed each other with lethal efficiency. Malnourished people fell sick more easily. The sick couldn't farm, couldn't travel, couldn't secure food. A population weakened by months of hunger met disease with no resistance. A population fighting disease had no strength left to find food. Together, they drove mortality to levels that seemed impossible until they happened. Massacres were common too, sometimes systematic, sometimes opportunistic, often swallowed by the larger catastrophe. Taiping forces slaughtered populations in regions considered loyal to the Qing. Government forces slaughtered populations suspected of Taiping support, and not every killing was ideological. Sometimes it was brutally practical, reducing populations that could not be controlled, fed, or trusted. Entire villages vanished, not as metaphor, as fact. Buildings were burned, populations killed or scattered, fields returned to wilderness. After the war, surveys found thousands of villages that had existed before the rebellion and no longer appeared on any register. The people were gone, the structures erased, and often no one remained who even remembered the names. Minorities suffered targeted destruction as the war peeled away restraints. The Taiping's militant Christianity drove persecution of Buddhist and Taoist communities. Government forces targeted Hakka populations suspected of Taiping's sympathy. Local conflicts that had simmered for generations suddenly erupted. Old grudges and ethnic tension unleashed under the cover of collapsing order. Some massacres were only loosely connected to the rebellion itself. The rebellion simply made them possible. Forced migration killed millions through exposure, exhaustion, and starvation. People fled, approaching armies carrying what they could, leaving everything else. Refugee streams swelled into hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. They overwhelmed the regions they passed through, draining food supplies and spreading disease. Most never reached safety. They died along the routes. Roads turned into corridors of death. The very young and the very old died first, and in greatest numbers. Infants perished when mothers, too malnourished to produce milk, could not feed them. Children couldn't survive on reduced rations that might keep an adult standing. The elderly, already fragile, succumbed quickly to hunger, illness, or cold. Families faced impossible arithmetic. Feeding those most likely to survive often meant watching the most vulnerable die. Women faced specific forms of terror. Rape was widespread and used by both sides. Women were kidnapped as forced laborers or concubines. Those who survived attacks often carried consequences that did not end when the violence ended. Pregnancy, stigma, abandonment, futures narrowed into destitution by the same social structures that made them vulnerable in the first place. This violence sits in the shadow of the larger carnage, but it touched millions of lives and left wounds that rarely entered official records. Death became so common, it lost its shock. Accounts describe populations going numb, walking past corpses on roads without reacting, hearing that an entire village had died and feeling nothing because it had become one story among countless others. Not because people became cruel, but because the human capacity to process horror has limits, and this war exceeded them. Indirect death was the rule, not the exception. Perhaps 90% of the dead never saw combat. They died in their homes when food ran out. They died fleeing a front that had no stable edge. They died of diseases that would not have killed them in normal times. They died because the systems that sustained life, agriculture, markets, sanitation, governance, collapsed, and without them, survival became a temporary accident. In that sense, the population became the battlefield. Both sides treated civilians as resources to be controlled, exploited, or denied to the enemy. Holding territory meant holding the people who could grow food, supply labor, and produce recruits. Denying territory meant making it unlivable, burning supplies, scattering communities, stripping regions until they could not support life or military movement. This wasn't always an unfortunate side effect. Often it was policy. Armies used starvation knowingly. Commanders ordered relocations, understanding most would not survive the journey. Leaders accepted mass civilian death because they calculated military advantage justified it. And over time, even those making decisions grew numb. After years of war and millions dead, ordering actions that would kill tens of thousands through hunger became an administrative choice, evaluated for strategic value, stripped of moral weight. Horror didn't vanish. It was simply exhausted. But a question remained, one that the body count can't answer. Why did this war become so destructive? Why couldn't it be contained, negotiated, ended? What turned a rebellion into a civilization-threatening catastrophe, one that killed on a scale almost without precedent? That answer lies in how the war was fought and why it kept feeding itself. The Taiping Rebellion lasted 14 years, from 1850 to 1864. That duration alone explains much of its lethality. A conflict that kills only 100,000 people a year becomes a catastrophe through persistence. But this war didn't last because no one could find the end. It lasted because its structure made an ending almost impossible. Neither side could win quickly through conventional means. The Taiping held vast territory and could field enormous armies, but they lacked the capacity to conquer all of China. Their ideology pulled some communities in and pushed others away, limiting expansion beyond core regions. The Qing possessed greater resources in theory, but early in the war, their military decay made decisive victory impossible. They could not reliably defeat Taiping forces in open battle, and the old instruments of state power failed under the strain. The result was a long, grinding stalemate. Neither side could win, neither side would surrender. For the Taiping, compromise was theologically impossible. They believed they were fulfilling a divine mandate. To bargain would be to betray heaven. For the Qing, The rebellion was an existential threat to dynastic legitimacy. Negotiation would have signaled weakness so complete it could fracture the empire. Both sides were locked into total war with no acceptable off-ramp. And as the war stretched, it stopped being fought only against an enemy army. It began to be fought against the landscape itself. Scorched earth strategies transformed contested regions into deliberate ruin. Retreating forces destroyed what might benefit the other side. Crops burned, wells poisoned, buildings demolished, populations scattered. This wasn't an occasional tactic. It became policy, implemented across wide areas with cold consistency. The aim was simple: deny resources. The result was worse: make entire regions uninhabitable. Qing commanders embraced this logic. Zheng Guofan, in particular, implemented policies of total devastation in rebellious zones. His forces tightened around Taiping territory and systematically destroyed agricultural capacity, turning farmland into famine zones. Starvation became a weapon. Civilian death was not collateral damage drifting behind military objectives. It was part of the mechanism. The Taiping responded in kind. When raiding or retreating, they stripped regions of supplies, seized food and livestock, conscripted labor, and left behind devastation that prevented government forces from living off the land. Mutual destruction produced landscapes where survival systems could not recover. No seed grain, no reserves, no functioning community life. Entire districts became death zones, regardless of loyalty, places where famine was simply the natural outcome of the next season. Then logistics failures multiplied the collapse. Neither side could supply armies reliably in the field, so armies fed themselves the oldest way, by taking. Requisition, foraging, plunder, different words for the same outcome. When a force of 50,000 passed through a region, it could strip everything edible in days. When multiple armies crossed the same territory over months and years, they removed not just food, but the possibility of future food: seed grain and livestock, tools and labor. What remained was hunger with a schedule. Because armies depended on what they could seize locally, devastated regions became dead ends. There was nothing left to take, and that pushed the war outward. Fresh territories still held resources. The need to feed armies expanded the geography of ruin, spreading the conflict and its indirect killing into ever larger areas. Command fragmentation ensured that even when restraint was possible, it rarely held. Taiping leadership fractured into competing factions, and the unity of the early movement dissolved into internal conflict, assassinations, purges, rival priorities. Orders from Nanjing could be ignored by regional commanders pursuing their own agendas. The Qing suffered a parallel fracture. Regional armies answered to their commanders more than to the center. Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and other leaders operated semi-independently, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. Coherent strategy across the entire theater became difficult, sometimes impossible. Even competent commanders could not coordinate the war as one machine. It became many wars stacked on top of each other, and in that kind of war, violence stops being a tool and becomes a habit. Atrocities multiplied beyond strategic logic. Years of fighting brutalized soldiers. Commanders lost the ability or the will to enforce discipline. Massacres happened not only because they served a purpose, but because they had become routine. Prisoners were tortured, civilians executed, communities destroyed. These were no longer exceptional moments of breakdown. They were reflexes in a conflict that had stripped away moral inhibition through repetition and exposure. The escalation fed itself. One atrocity demanded revenge. Revenge provoked greater retaliation. Each side's horror became the other side's justification. Commanders who might have wanted restraint found themselves unable to control troops who had seen too much, lost too much, and learned to treat cruelty as normal. Administrative collapse removed what little restraint remained. In contested areas, local government stopped functioning. Tax collection failed, which meant relief could not be funded even when the desire existed. Courts and legal systems disappeared, leaving no justice and no limitation on predation. Social organizations that once provided mutual aid collapsed under the weight of need. War zones became spaces where power belonged to whoever carried weapons. In that vacuum, the lines blurred. Bandits claimed affiliation with whichever side was convenient. Opportunists became soldiers for a season, then criminals the next. Temporary fiefdoms rose and fell. The distinction between combatant and predator evaporated. Anyone armed could victimize anyone unarmed. The war created a marketplace of violence and then kept feeding it. Repression was also ideologically weaponized. The Qing framed the struggle not as a civil war among subjects, but as the extermination of evil. Rebels were described not as misguided people, but as demons to be eliminated. Under that framing, there were no prisoners, only criminals. There were no neutral civilians, only co-conspirators. Policies of total destruction became righteous action, and ideology is a solvent. It dissolves the limits that might otherwise hold. If you believe you are fighting demons, there are no rules. If you believe a population is spiritually contaminated, their death becomes purification rather than atrocity. This rhetoric made it easier, psychologically and politically, to implement measures that killed on a vast scale. So the war became a system without breaks. Duration gave time for destruction to compound. Scorched earth policy targeted the foundations of civilian survival. Logistics failure forced armies to live by predation. Fragmented command prevented coordination and restraint. Routine atrocity erased moral boundaries. Administrative collapse erased institutional boundaries. Ideological framing justified elimination. Any one of these factors would have made the conflict deadly. Together, they produced a storm of devastation that turned war into a civilization-wide catastrophe, one where the primary victims were not soldiers, but the population trapped inside a machine that treated human life as expendable. By the final years, victory had begun to lose meaning. Whoever prevailed would inherit a country hollowed out, its economy shattered, its people traumatized, its regions depopulated. The war had outgrown its origins and become something self-perpetuating, continuing not because anyone still believed in a clean outcome, but because no one could see how to stop it. And when it finally ended, it did not end gently. The Taiping Rebellion ended in 1864 with the fall of Nanjing after a brutal siege that had lasted months. Qing forces, supported by foreign-trained units and Western military advisors, finally broke the city's defenses. What followed was not victory in any conventional sense. It was slaughter, the final expression of what 14 years of war had trained both sides to become. The fall of Nanjing was apocalyptic. Taiping defenders knew what capture meant. They fought with the desperation of people who expected execution and had nothing left to bargain with. Once the walls were breached, the fighting didn't end. It moved inward, street by street, house by house, until the city became a maze of killing. Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king whose visions had sparked the catastrophe, was already dead. He had died weeks earlier, possibly by suicide, possibly by illness, leaving the movement in the hands of a teenage son installed as successor. The boy was captured. He was executed. The heavenly kingdom ended not with a surrender, but with a severed line. Then the city itself was punished. Nanjing's population faced systematic massacre. Qing troops made little distinction between armed rebels, civilian supporters, and ordinary residents trapped inside during the siege. Estimates of the dead range from around 100,000 to several 100,000. Uncertainty born from the chaos of the killing and the scale that made precise counting almost meaningless. Bodies clogged streets and canals. Corpses drifted into the Yangtze River. The violence continued for days until exhaustion and the absence of living targets finally slowed it. But Nanjing was not an ending. It was a signal. Mass retaliation spread outward as Taiping held territories fell. Government forces implemented collective punishment. Villages that had supported the rebellion were suspected of supporting it or had simply been caught in the wrong geography were destroyed. Populations were massacred, scattered, relocated. The intention was not merely to defeat an army, but to burn out the social ground that had allowed the rebellion to exist, so thoroughly that nothing could rise from it again. Even after the war's formal end, killing continued. Executions claimed hundreds of thousands more. Captured Taiping soldiers, officials, and suspected sympathizers faced trials that were perfunctory when they occurred at all. Most were executed outright, often publicly, as warning. It was framed as justice, but it functioned as deterrence, make the cost of rebellion so absolute that memory itself would police future generations. These executions were performances of state violence, deliberate, visible, meant to be retold. Beheadings, torture before death, the display of corpses, not excess, but policy. The message was not subtle. This is what happens when you challenge the dynasty. Across the war zone, cities lay in ruins. Nanjing, Yangzhou, Suzhou, centers that had once been among China's wealthiest, were shattered. Buildings were destroyed in fighting or deliberately burned. Infrastructure that had taken centuries to build was gone. Populations that had reached into the hundreds of thousands were reduced to tens of thousands of stunned survivors. Physical ruin was matched by economic obliteration. Trade routes broken, industries erased, accumulated wealth looted or burned into smoke. In the countryside, the destruction ran deeper because it attacked the future. Agricultural regions fought over repeatedly were left barren. Fields reverted to wilderness after years without cultivation. Irrigation systems were wrecked and not repaired. Villages stood empty. Even areas that had escaped direct battle suffered from the war's mechanics: forced conscription, requisition, collapsed markets. Recovery would take decades. Some regions never fully regained what they had been. The Qing dynasty survived, but it emerged fundamentally weakened. The rebellion had proven the central government could not defend itself without relying on regional armies commanded by semi-independent leaders. Figures like Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and Zhuo Zongtang rose from the war with power bases that did not belong to Beijing. They commanded the only effective forces and controlled regional revenues. The dynasty still ruled in name, but authority was fragmenting into something more brittle. Foreign influence also deepened. The Qing relied on Western advisors, bought foreign weapons, and used foreign-led forces such as the ever-victorious army. That support came at a cost. More concessions, more treaty ports, more foreign presence. The dynasty survived the Taiping, but its survival moved in the direction of dependence, and beneath politics and economics was something harder to measure and harder to repair. The trauma was collective. Survivors had lived through 14 years of continuous warfare, watched atrocities unfold, lost families to starvation and violence, seen communities erased. This was not suffering that ended when the fighting stopped. It became generational damage, shaping how people trusted, how they feared, how they raised children, how they reacted to later crises. The psychological scars matched the physical ruin. Population losses were uneven but staggering. Some regions lost 70 to 80% of their pre-war populations. Others emerged relatively intact. The imbalance disrupted everything: labor availability, local economies, marriage markets, the basic structure of communities. In some places, the demographic profile became grotesque: elderly and children with barely any adults in prime working years. Rebuilding wasn't only difficult, it was mathematically constrained by the absence of people. China, after the Taiping, was unrecognizable. The cultural confidence that had long defined civilization, its sense of continuity, even superiority, was fractured. The Qing had demonstrated incompetence and survived only by outsourcing force to regional commanders and foreign support. The economy was broken, the population was wounded, the social order had been stretched until it tore, and peace did not arrive as relief. Other crises were already burning: the Nian Rebellion in the north, Muslim rebellions in the northwest and southwest, continued foreign pressure, The end of the Taiping did not bring stability. It only freed the state to stagger toward the next emergency. The dynasty would limp on until 1911, but its effective authority had been gutted by the war it barely survived. Worst of all, the victory solved none of the conditions that had produced the catastrophe. Population pressure remained, inequality remained, corruption remained, military weakness remained, often worse than before. Tens of millions had died, and nothing better had replaced what was destroyed. The heavenly kingdom was gone, but no redemption followed. China was simply smaller, poorer, and more vulnerable. Survivors faced the task of rebuilding without resources, without institutional support, and often without hope. Villages had to be reconstructed by communities too depleted to do the work. Fields had to be cleared and replanted despite the absence of tools, draft animals, or seed grain. Social structures had to be rebuilt despite the deaths or displacement of those who once held them together. The labor was crushing, and many did not survive the attempt. The Taiping Rebellion was over, but its legacy was not. It left a demonstration written in ash. What happens when ideological certainty meets state collapse, when war becomes policy, when civilian life becomes the battlefield? And it created a precedent, proof that internal conflict could destroy a civilization from within, long before modern weapons arrived to make killing easier. When we place the Taiping Rebellion beside the conflicts that dominate global memory, the numbers force an uncomfortable reckoning. World War II killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people in 6 years. Industrial armies, mechanized logistics, aerial bombardment, systematic genocide. The Taiping Rebellion may have killed 30 to 70 million over 14 years, using pre-industrial methods, blades, fire, famine, and scorched earth. Year by year, the scale of death becomes harder to dismiss. Comparable devastation, without modern weapons. That comparison exposes a disturbing truth. Industrialized technology is not required for mass death. The Taiping proved that traditional weapons, fused with ideological certainty, administrative collapse, and a willingness to target civilian survival systems, could produce casualties approaching 20th century total war. The tools mattered, but the system mattered more. How violence was organized, normalized, and prolonged until restraint simply stopped existing. And the methods did not vanish with the 19th century. The deliberate starvation strategies that killed millions during the rebellion would reappear in different forms throughout the 20th century. Stalin's manufactured famines in Ukraine, Mao's policies during the Great Leap Forward, Ethiopia under the Derg. Weaponizing food is not a modern invention. The Taiping era demonstrated how efficient it could be when power decides that human bodies are acceptable losses in pursuit of control. Yet the history itself remains obscure. Military academies study the American Civil War in exhaustive detail, despite its far smaller death toll. The Taiping Rebellion, larger, longer, and filled with patterns that would repeat globally, barely registers. This selective memory hints at something deeper than ignorance, discomfort with what this war reveals about violence that comes from within a society, not from outside it. Because one of the Taiping's most brutal lessons is that internal war can be more destructive than external conflict. That pattern would echo through the modern era: China's war between communists and nationalists, the Russian Civil War, the Congolese conflicts, Rwanda's genocide. The deadliest struggles of the last century were overwhelmingly internal. The Taiping Rebellion may have been the first civilization-scale proof of a truth we still resist. Populations are often most vulnerable to violence from their own political and social world, not from foreign enemies. The rebellion also anticipated total war in another way. The population became both the target and the weapon. Civilians were not simply caught between armies. They were the terrain the war was fought over. To control people was to control food production, labor, and recruits. To deny territory to an enemy was to render it uninhabitable, strip it, burn it, starve it, scatter it. This logic reduced human beings to resources to be exploited or removed. and it would become central to later conflicts long after the Taiping had faded from common memory. Ideology made this transformation possible. Hong Xiuquan's fusion of Christian millenarianism with anti-Manchu nationalism created a certainty that justified unlimited violence. Believers were not just fighting a government. They believed they were establishing heaven on earth. Compromise became betrayal. Atrocity became purification. That pattern, absolute ideological certainty dissolving moral restraint, would recur under fascism, communism, and nationalist movements that collectively killed on staggering scales. The Taiping also shattered a comforting narrative about modern violence. We like to believe that mass death is a product of technological advancement, that machine guns, bombs, and industrial logistics are what turn war into slaughter. The Taiping Rebellion complicates that story. It showed that comparable death tolls could be reached through systematic pre-industrial methods, as long as the restraints on violence were removed and destruction was applied with coordination rather than momentary rage. And yet the precedent was largely ignored. When the 20th century produced enormous civilian casualties, many observers treated it as unprecedented horror enabled by modern weapons. But the Taiping had already demonstrated the core mechanics. Starvation used deliberately, civilians treated as strategic material, entire regions devastated until life could not return. The shock of later wars was shaped in part by amnesia, by forgetting what had already been proven possible. China's own 20th century conflicts carried echoes that are difficult to miss. The Chinese Communist Revolution mobilized masses through ideology, used policies that produced starvation, and targeted civilian populations in ways that resemble earlier patterns of internal war. The Cultural Revolution, while ideologically different, moved along a familiar rail: certainty defining enemies, populations mobilized for persecution, state power used to reshape society regardless of human cost. So why does the silence persist? Part of it is Western historical bias, who gets recorded, translated, memorialized. But the silence is not only Western. Chinese historical memory of the Taiping is politically complicated. The rebellion can be framed as an anti-imperial uprising that prefigured revolution, and also as a warning about ideological excess and chaos. The communist state has alternately celebrated and suppressed the Taiping, depending on political needs, leaving a legacy of ambivalence that contributes to confusion and quiet. The war's broader lesson is stark. The deadliest conflicts are not necessarily the most technologically advanced or strategically important. They are the ones that remove restraints on violence, target civilian life systematically, and last long enough for destruction to compound. Duration, ideology, administrative collapse, and the willingness to accept mass civilian death matter more than weapons alone. And historical amnesia makes repetition easier. Each time starvation is weaponized, each time civilians become deliberate targets, each time ideology mobilizes populations into mutual destruction, the world treats it as a new horror, despite the Taiping precedent. Forgetting turns patterns into surprises. It allows the same mechanics to be rediscovered again and again at the cost of lives that never needed to be spent. The Taiping Rebellion stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for self-destruction and as a warning about what happens when certainty meets collapse. It killed more people than any war before it, and possibly more than any since, yet it remains largely unknown. And that silence may be the final brutality. Not only that tens of millions died, but that the world learned so little because it chose not to look. This war didn't just kill millions. It proved that human destruction doesn't require modern weapons, only desperation, belief, and time. Why do you think the deadliest war in history is barely discussed today? Comment below.